Detective Mark Harlan was the kind of man who walked into a room and expected people to notice. At 42, he had spent half his life wearing the badge, and it wasn't just a piece of metal pinned to his chest. It was part of who he was. To him, being a cop wasn't just a job. It was a calling. He believed in the law with an almost religious fervor, convinced that it existed to separate the good from the bad. And in his mind, there was no gray area, only black and white. Mark's confidence didn't come out of nowhere. Over the years, he'd built a reputation as one of the sharpest detectives in the department. His arrest record was impressive. His instincts were sharp, and his superiors trusted him without question. But what really fueled his ego was the way people looked at him when they saw that badge. Strangers deferred to him, colleagues respected him, and criminals feared him. It made him feel untouchable, like nothing could ever shake his place in the world. But it wasn't just his career that fed his sense of invincibility. Lately, Mark had started dating Sarah, a high-powered defense attorney known for her razor-sharp arguments and courtroom victories. Their relationship was unconventional, sure, a cop and a lawyer. But Mark loved the irony of it. He saw their pairing as proof that justice could bridge even the widest divides. Plus, Sarah was smart, beautiful, and successful, and being with her only added to his aura of authority. In his mind, they were the perfect team, two sides of the same coin working toward the same goal. Still, Mark couldn't help but think he held the upper hand in their dynamic. After all, he was the one who caught the bad guys, while Sarah spent her days defending them. He often joked that she should switch teams and join the right side, though Sarah always laughed it off. She knew better than to take his teasing too seriously, but deep down, Mark truly believed he was on the moral high ground. To him, the law was clear-cut, and anyone who tried to bend it was either knave or corrupt. What Mark didn't realize was how much his confidence bordered on arrogance. He carried himself with an air of superiority, assuming that his badge gave him not just authority but infallibility. If someone questioned his methods, he brushed it off as jealousy or ignorance. If a suspect claimed innocence, he assumed they were lying. And if a colleague suggested caution, he dismissed it as overthinking. In his world, Mark was always right, and everyone else just needed to catch up. This mindset shaped every decision he made, both personally and professionally. It influenced how he treated suspects, how he interacted with coworkers, and even how he navigated his relationship with Sarah. He never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as infallible as he thought. Because in Mark's mind, the badge wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a shield against doubt, criticism, and failure. Or so he believed. Little did he know, life had a way of humbling even the proudest among us. And for Mark Harlan, that humbling moment was closer than he could have imagined. It was a chilly Thursday evening when Mark found himself cruising through one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. The streets were dimly lit, and the air carried the faint smell of damp concrete and old trash. This part of town wasn't unfamiliar to him. It was where most of his arrests happened. People here knew his face, and he knew theirs. To Mark, this area was a breeding ground for trouble, and he prided himself on being the guy who cleaned it up. As he drove slowly down a narrow street, his eyes scanned the shadows. That's when he saw her, a young woman sitting behind the wheel of a beat-up sedan parked under a flickering street lamp. Her name was Elena Morales, though Mark didn't know that yet. All he noticed was the nervous way she glanced at her rearview mirror, and then quickly looked away when his patrol car passed by. Something about her behavior caught his attention. It wasn't overtly suspicious. No sudden movements, no obvious signs of wrongdoing. But Mark's instincts told him to double back. He pulled up behind her car and turned on his flashing lights. As he stepped out of the cruiser, he adjusted his belt, the weight of his gun and badge reminding him of the authority he carried. "License and registration," he said firmly as he approached her window. Elena complied quietly, handing over the documents with trembling hands. Mark noted her unease but chalked it up to nerves. After all, Not many people stayed calm when a cop showed up. While running her information through his system, Mark decided to search the vehicle. He'd seen enough cases where drugs or weapons were stashed in cars like this one. Sure enough, tucked between the seats, he found a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be cocaine. His heart quickened, not because he doubted the find, but because he felt vindicated. Another criminal caught red-handed. "This yours?" Mark asked, holding up the bag. Alina's eyes widened in shock. "No. I swear, I don't know how that got there," she protested, her voice rising with panic. But Mark had heard it all before. Every suspect claimed innocence. Every story sounded rehearsed. He shook his head slightly, already dismissing her words as lies. "You're coming with me," he said flatly, cuffing her hands behind her back. Alina struggled to keep her composure, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded. "Please, Detective, you have to believe me. Someone must have put it there. I didn't do anything wrong." But Mark wasn't listening. To him, the evidence was clear, and her protests were just noise, a distraction meant to throw him off. Back at the station, Mark booked Elena without hesitation. He filled out the paperwork methodically, ticking boxes and attaching photos of the evidence. In his mind, this was another open and shut case. Just another lowlife trying to wiggle out of responsibility. He didn't bother digging deeper into her background or questioning whether the drugs really belonged to her. Why would he? The system worked, and he trusted it completely. What Mark failed to consider was that sometimes the system made mistakes. And this time, his blind faith in his own judgment might lead to consequences far greater than he could imagine. For now, though, he left the station feeling satisfied, convinced that justice had been served. Little did he know, the wheels of fate were already turning, and they wouldn't stop until his world came crashing down. Elena Morel sat alone in her jail cell, the cold metal bars casting long shadows across the floor. Her mind raced with fear and frustration. She kept replaying the events of the night in her head, trying to figure out how the drugs had ended up in her car. Someone had set her up. That much was clear. But who? And why? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving her feeling more trapped than ever. Unbeknownst to Elena, she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. When news of her arrest reached her older sister, Carmen Vega, it lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Carmen wasn't just any lawyer. She was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. Known for taking on cases others deemed impossible, she had spent years challenging police misconduct and fighting for justice in a system often stacked against the vulnerable. To Carmen, this wasn't just another case. It was personal. Carmen arrived at the station early the next morning, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she demanded to see her sister. The officers recognized her immediately. She had a reputation for being relentless, unafraid to call out corruption or incompetence when she saw it. As soon as Carmen stepped into the visiting area and saw Elena's tear-streaked face, her heart sank, but her resolve hardened. "Don't worry," she said firmly, gripping Elena's hand through the glass partition. "We're going to fix this." Back at her office, Carmen got to work. She started by reviewing the details of the arrest, poring over every piece of evidence and scrutinizing the circumstances. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. For one thing, the arresting officer, Detective Mark Harlan, had a history of aggressive tactics. Over the years, there had been whispers about his methods, though nothing substantial enough to stick. Still, Carmen's instincts told her to dig deeper. She also noticed inconsistencies in the timeline of events. According to Elena, she had borrowed the car from a friend earlier that day because hers was in the shop. If someone wanted to frame her, planting drugs in a borrowed vehicle would have been an easy way to do it. But proving that theory wouldn't be simple. Carmen knew they'd need solid evidence. And fast. As Carmen built her strategy, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anger. This wasn't just about clearing Elena's name. It was about holding the system accountable. Too often, people like Elena, people without power or connections, were treated as disposable, their lives ruined by careless mistakes or outright abuses of authority. Carmen refused to let that happen this time. Her determination only grew stronger when she learned who the arresting officer was dating. Sarah Bennett, a defense attorney Carmen had mentored early in her career. While Carmen admired Sarah professionally, she couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. A cop and a lawyer, a relationship that blurred ethical lines and raised uncomfortable questions. Was this simply bad luck, or was there something more sinister at play? By the time Carmen finished drafting her initial motion to dismiss the charges, she felt a mixed trough of emotions. Frustration at the injustice, hope for what lay ahead, and a fierce commitment to seeing this through. She picked up the phone and dialed Elena's number, her voice steady and reassuring. "Listen carefully," she said. "This is going to get messy, but I promise you one thing. We're not backing down. Not until we expose the truth." For Elena, those words were a lifeline. For Carmen, they were a declaration of war. Whoever thought they could railroad her little sister had made a grave mistake. And as far as Carmen was concerned, Detective Mark Harlan was about to learn that no one, not even someone with a shiny badge, was untouchable. Mark's confidence was unshakable, even as the days passed and whispers about Elena Morales' case began to circulate around the station. To him, it was just another arrest, nothing out of the ordinary. But what he didn't realize was that his casual attitude toward the case would lead to a mistake so glaring it would come back to haunt him. One evening, Mark met Sarah for dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. The dim lighting and soft hum of conversation created an intimate atmosphere, but Mark wasn't there to enjoy the ambience. He was in a talkative mood, eager to share details about his latest big win. As they sipped wine and shared plates of pasta, he brought up Elena's arrest with a self-satisfied smirk. "You should have seen her face when I found the drugs," he said, leaning back in his chair. "She tried to play innocent, but we both know how that story ends." Sarah listened quietly, her fork pausing midair. She had always been careful to avoid discussing ongoing cases with Mark. It was one of her firm boundaries. But tonight, something about his tone caught her attention. "What's her name?" she asked casually, though her voice carried a note of curiosity. "Elena Morales," Mark replied without hesitation. "Why? You're not thinking of taking her case, are you?" Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Carmen Vega, the same Carmen who had mentored her early in her career, the same Carmen she respected deeply, was Elena's older sister. How had she not made the connection before? Suddenly, Sarah felt a wave of unease wash over her. This wasn't just some random suspect. This was personal for Carmen, and if Carmen was involved, things were bound to get complicated. "Mark," Sarah began carefully, lowering her voice, "you need to be careful with this one. Carmen Vega is handling the defense." For a moment, Mark looked confused. Then recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by dismissal. "Carmen Vega. So what? She's just another lawyer trying to make a name for herself. Trust me, Sarah, this case is open and shut. There's no way she'll get her client off." Sarah sighed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't understand. Carmen doesn't take cases unless she believes in them. And if she's stepping in, it means there's more to this than meets the eye. Maybe you should step back before you dig yourself into a hole." But Mark wasn't listening. His ego wouldn't allow it. Instead, he waved off her concerns with a laugh. "Relax, Sarah. I've been doing this longer than you've been practicing law. I know what I'm doing. Besides, my record speaks for itself." The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was walking into a storm he wasn't prepared for. She knew Carmen well enough to understand that she wouldn't back down without a fight. And she certainly wouldn't hesitate to expose any misconduct, no matter how high-profile the officer involved. For the first time, Sarah wondered if Mark's arrogance might blind him to the consequences of his actions. As they left the restaurant, Sarah turned to him, her expression serious. Just promise me you'll think about what I said, okay? This isn't a game, Mark. People's lives are at stake. Mark nodded absently, but his mind was already elsewhere. He believed he was untouchable, that his badge protected him from scrutiny. What he failed to see was that every action has a reaction, and his careless words at the dinner table had set something in motion that neither he nor Sarah could stop. Unbeknownst to Mark, Sarah spent the rest of the night staring at her phone, debating whether to call Carmen. In the end, she decided against it, knowing full well that crossing that line could destroy her relationship with Mark. But as she lay awake, tossing and turning, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this situation was spiraling out of control, and that Mark's refusal to listen might cost him everything. The courtroom was packed on the day of Elena Morella's trial, buzzing with anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes in the back rows, while spectators whispered among themselves, eager to see how this high-stakes case would unfold. At the center of it all sat Detective Mark Harlan, his usual confidence masking a growing unease. He hadn't expected so much attention, or resistance, from the defense. Carmen Vega wasted no time taking control of the room. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, she stood tall and commanding as she approached the judge's bench. Her opening statement was concise but powerful. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of guilt or innocence. It's a case of misconduct, overreach, and a rush to judgment by those sworn to uphold justice." The words hung heavy in the air, and Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When it came time for Carmen to question him on the stand, Mark braced himself. He had testified dozens of times before, always with ease, but something about Carmen's presence made him feel exposed. She began with simple questions: his name, rank, years of service, but quickly shifted gears. "Detective Harlan," she said, her tone polite yet pointed, "can you walk us through the events leading up to Ms. Morella's arrest?" Mark recounted the story just as he had written it in his report, emphasizing how he'd found the drugs tucked between the seats of Elena's car. But Carmen wasn't satisfied. "You mentioned earlier that Ms. Morales appeared nervous during your initial interaction," she said, glancing at her notes. "Could you elaborate on that? Was there anything specific that caught your attention?" She kept looking at her rearview mirror. Mark replied, trying to sound authoritative. "It seemed suspicious. Suspicious enough to warrant searching her vehicle." Carmen pressed. "Or did you decide to search it because of where she was parked, in a neighborhood known for its crime rate?" Mark hesitated, realizing too late that he walked into a trap. Carmen seized the opportunity. "Isn't it true, Detective, that profiling based on location alone is not only unethical but also unconstitutional? Did you consider that Ms. Morales might have been nervous simply because a police officer pulled her over, a situation that makes most people uneasy?" The courtroom fell silent as Mark struggled to respond. His certainty began to crack under Carmen's relentless questioning. She moved on to the evidence itself, presenting expert testimony, suggesting the bag of cocaine could have been placed in the car after Elena borrowed it. Witnesses came forward, including the friend who had lent Elena the vehicle, swearing they hadn't seen the drugs beforehand. As the trial progressed, more cracks emerged in the prosecution's case. Dash-cam footage from Mark's patrol car revealed inconsistencies in his account of the arrest. One clip showed him rifling through the car without probable cause, raising questions about whether the search was justified. Another showed Elena repeatedly insisting the drugs weren't hers, a detail conspicuously absent from Mark's written report. Watching from the gallery, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had warned Mark to tread carefully, but now it was clear he had underestimated Carmen and overestimated his own invincibility. Every cross-examination, every piece of evidence presented, chipped away at the narrative Mark had built. For the first time, doubt crept into the minds of the jurors. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had started as an open and shut case was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Mark left the stand feeling shaken, his once unwavering belief in his righteousness faltering. As he looked around the room, he realized the tide was turning against him. and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For Carmen, the battle was far from over, but she allowed herself a small flicker of satisfaction. Justice, she knew, wasn't won overnight, but step by step, she was dismantling the walls of arrogance and bias that had shielded men like Mark Harlan for far too long. As the trial stretched into its second week, the cracks in Mark's case widened into chasms. Each day brought new revelations that painted a troubling picture of his conduct, not just during Elena's arrest, but possibly in other cases as well. Carmen Vega was relentless, presenting witness after witness who cast doubt on Mark's methods. Some were former suspects who claimed they'd been coerced or pressured into confessing crimes they didn't commit. Others were colleagues who admitted off the record that Mark often played fast and loose, with procedure when it suited him. For Mark, the courtroom became a place of mounting dread. Every morning, he walked in hoping to regain control of the narrative, only to find himself cornered by Carmen's razor-sharp arguments. The jurors' expressions grew harder to read. Some scribbled furiously in their notebooks, while others avoided meeting his eyes altogether. Even Judge Harris, usually stoic, seemed increasingly skeptical of the prosecution's claims. It was becoming painfully clear that this wasn't just about Elena Morales anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. Outside the courthouse, tensions simmered between Mark and Sarah. Their conversations at home turned into heated arguments, each one more exhausting than the last. "Why won't you admit you made a mistake?" Sarah demanded one evening, pacing the living room floor. "You're digging yourself deeper every time you refuse to take responsibility." "I didn't do anything wrong," Mark shot back, slamming his fist on the table. "This is Carmen Vega playing games, twisting facts to make me look bad. You know how these lawyers are." "No, Mark," Sarah said sharply, her voice trembling with frustration. "This isn't about Carmen. This is about you. About your arrogance, your refusal to listen when someone tries to warn you. If you'd stepped back when I told you to, none of this would have blown up like it has." Her words stung because they hit too close to the truth. Deep down, Mark knew she was right, but admitting it felt impossible. His entire identity was tied to being a good cop, someone who stood for justice. How could he face himself, or anyone else, if he acknowledged that he might not be as flawless as he believed? The breaking point came late one night after another grueling day in court. Sarah sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, while Mark brooded in silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer but no less firm. "I can't keep doing this, Mark. Watching you destroy yourself, and maybe even innocent people along the way, is tearing me apart. I love you, but I can't stand by while you ignore the damage you're causing." Mark looked at her, stunned. For the first time, he saw the toll this ordeal had taken on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the sadness etched into her face. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. All he could manage was a quiet, defeated, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need a break," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe forever. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, not when you put your pride above everything else." When she left the next morning, taking only a suitcase and her car keys, Mark felt the ground crumble beneath him. For so long, he'd relied on his badge and his relationships to define him. Now both were slipping through his fingers, leaving him hollow and alone. At work, things weren't any better. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into his conduct following anonymous tips, likely spurred by Carmen's efforts. Rumors swirled around the station, and once loyal colleagues began avoiding him. The badge that had once symbolized power now felt like a weight dragging him down. For the first time in his life, Mark Harlan questioned whether he deserved to wear it at all. The verdict came on a gray, overcast morning, the kind of day that matched Mark Harlan's mood perfectly. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. As the jury filed in, Mark sat stiffly beside the prosecutor, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He barely dared to breathe as the foreman stood, and announced their decision: not guilty. For Elena Morales, the verdict was a moment of vindication. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her sister, Carmen, who allowed herself a rare smile. Justice had been served, at least for now. But for Mark, the verdict was a gut punch, a public declaration that everything he had believed about himself and his work was wrong. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Carmen and Elena, eager for quotes and sound bites. Carmen didn't mince words. "This case wasn't just about clearing my client's name," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "It was about holding law enforcement accountable when they abused their power. Detective Harlan's actions were reckless, and today's verdict sends a clear message: no one is above the law." Mark heard every word as he pushed his way through the crowd, his head bowed to avoid the cameras. The humiliation burned deep, but what stung even more was the truth behind Carmen's statement. For years, he had seen himself as a protector of justice, someone who stood between order and chaos. Now he couldn't escape the realization that he had become part of the problem. Back at the station, things only got worse. Internal affairs investigators called him in repeatedly, asking pointed questions about not just Elena's case, but other arrests he'd made over the years. Colleagues whispered behind his back, speculating about how far the investigation would go. Some expressed sympathy, but most kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with someone under such intense scrutiny. Even Captain Reynolds, who had always been Mark's biggest supporter, gave him a somber look during one meeting and said, "You need to prepare yourself, son. This might not end well." Suspension came soon after, pending the outcome of the investigation. Without the structure of his job, or Sarah's presence at home, Mark found himself adrift. Days stretched into weeks, each one lonelier than the last. He spent hours sitting in his dimly lit living room, staring at the empty spot on his belt where his badge used to rest. It wasn't just gone. It felt like it had been ripped away, leaving behind a void he didn't know how to fill. At first, anger consumed him. He blamed everyone but himself. Carmen for being too aggressive, Sarah for leaving, the system for turning against him. But as the days passed, the anger began to fade, replaced by something harder to face: shame. Slowly, painfully, Mark started to see the cracks in his own armor. His arrogance, his refusal to listen, his belief that the badge made him infallible, all of it had led him here. One night, unable to sleep, Mark flipped through old case files, searching for answers. He revisited arrests he had once been proud of, looking at them through fresh eyes. What he saw shocked him: patterns of haste, assumptions where evidence should have been, moments when he had prioritized results over fairness. Each file felt like another brick added to the wall separating him from the man he thought he was. Desperate for guidance, Mark reached out to an old mentor, retired Detective Carl Jenkins. Over coffee, he poured out his heart, confessing his fears and regrets. Carl listened quietly before offering some hard truths. "Being a cop isn't about being perfect, Mark," he said gently. "It's about owning your mistakes and learning from them. If you want to fix this, not just for others, but for yourself, you've got to start by facing what you did wrong." Those words stuck with Mark long after their meeting ended. Redemption wouldn't come easily, and forgiveness, even from himself, would take time. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild, not the life he had lost, but something better, something real. Months had passed since the trial, and Mark Harlan's life was barely recognizable. The badge that once defined him was gone, replaced by a suspension letter he kept tucked away in a drawer, too ashamed to look at it. His apartment felt emptier than ever, not just because Sarah wasn't there, but because the weight of his mistakes pressed down on every corner. Yet, amidst the wreckage of his old life, something unexpected began to take root: a desire to change. It started small. One rainy afternoon, while aimlessly scrolling through social media, Mark stumbled across an ad for a community outreach program aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. At first he scrolled past it, dismissing it as irrelevant. But later that night, unable to sleep, he found himself thinking about it again. What harm could it do? He had nothing left to lose. The next morning, Mark showed up at the community center where the program was held. It was a modest brick building in a neighborhood he patrolled countless times but never truly understood. Inside, he was greeted by a group of volunteers, teachers, counselors, former inmates, and activists, all working together to bridge gaps he had spent years widening. They eyed him warily when he introduced himself, their skepticism written plainly on their faces. "I'm here to help," he said simply, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. At first, Mark struggled. Listening without judgment didn't come naturally to him. Neither did admitting fault or sharing his story. During one particularly raw session, a young man named Jamal, a former suspect Mark had arrested years ago, called him out in front of the group. "You think showing up here makes you a good guy now?" Jamal asked, his voice laced with anger. "What about all the people you hurt before?" Mark wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was trying, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "You're right. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to do better." To his surprise, Jamal softened after that, and over time, they even formed a tentative friendship. As weeks turned into months, Mark threw himself into the work. He attended counseling sessions to confront his own biases and blind spots. He volunteered at youth programs, mentoring kids who reminded him of the person he used to be: cocky, defensive, and unwilling to listen. Slowly, he began to see the world through their eyes, recognizing the fear and mistrust he had once dismissed as resistance. Word of his efforts eventually reached internal affairs, though the investigation into his conduct remained ongoing. Some of his colleagues noted the sincerity of his transformation. Captain Reynolds even called him in for a meeting, offering cautious encouragement. "Change takes time, Mark," he said, "but if you keep going like this, maybe there's hope for you yet." Still, redemption wasn't easy or guaranteed. Many doubted his intentions, accusing him of performing penance for selfish reasons. Others refused to forgive him, and Mark couldn't blame them. He knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, not yet, but he hoped that someday his actions might speak louder than his failures. One evening, as he walked home from the community center, Mark stopped by a park where he used to patrol. Kids played basketball under flickering streetlights, laughter echoing into the night. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. Maybe he'd never fully escaped the shadow of his past, but he realized something important. Real strength wasn't about being untouchable. It was about having the courage to face your flaws and try anyway. Whether Mark would find true redemption remained uncertain. But as he stood there, watching the city breathe around him, he allowed himself a moment of quiet hope. Life had humbled him, stripped him bare, and forced him to start over. And though the road ahead was long, he finally understood that the hardest part of healing wasn't asking for forgiveness. It was learning how to give it to yourself.